If I woke up at 60 and discovered the country I lived in was carrying debt so large that it could no longer be discussed, honestly, I would not ask how the government planned to pay it off. That is the wrong question. Governments almost never solve debt problems. The way disciplined households imagine debt should be solved. They do not quietly apologize, tighten their belt, and write the check. They usually do something more subtle, more political, and more dangerous for ordinary savers. They change who pays. That is the real story. And if you misunderstand that, you will spend the next decade protecting the wrong things with your money. Most people still think a debt crisis is a dramatic event, a missed payment, a default, a humiliating headline. Some obvious break in the system that gives everyone fair warning before the damage arrives. I have learned to fear a different version. I fear the kind of debt crisis where the checks still clear, the Treasury still borrows, the central bank still speaks calmly, and ordinary people slowly discover that the system solved its problem by making their savings, their wages, and their purchasing power carry more of the burden than they realized. That is the version history prefers, not because it is moral, because it is politically survivable. And that is what I want to talk about here. Not one man, not one hearing, not one speech, not one date on a calendar. I want to talk about the deeper machine because when the leadership changes at the Federal Reserve, the public tends to think in personalities. Will he cut? Will he not cut? Is he dovish? Is he hawkish? Is he loyal to the president? Is he independent? All of that matters around the edges, but it misses the larger problem. The larger problem is arithmetic. The United States is carrying more than $39 trillion in total public debt, and the cost of servicing that debt has become enormous. Powell's term as Fed chair ends on May 15, 2026, as of late April. Kevin Warsh is President Trump's nominee to succeed him, and the federal funds target range remains 3.5% to 3.75%. Base site Fay turn 312,263 search. 8 Fay turn 312,263 search. 0 Fay turn 216,104 search. 12 Fay turn 216,104 search. 6 Fay, those are the visible facts. The invisible fact is what they imply. A government with that much debt is no longer just a borrower. It becomes a rate. Sensitive organism, that means every debate about interest rates, inflation, the Fed's balance sheet, and financial regulation stops being a technical discussion for economists and becomes a battle over who will absorb the pressure. The government, the banking system, pension funds, foreign buyers, savers, workers, asset holders, somebody always pays. The only real question is through which channel. That is why I do not spend much time asking whether the debt will be canceled. Debt of this scale is not canceled. It is translated. It is spread. It is repriced. It is diluted through money. It is compressed through low real returns. It is softened by inflation. It is carried by institutions that did not choose it freely. It is made to feel smaller by making everything else larger in nominal terms. That is the mechanism. And once you understand that, the whole story changes. You stop waiting for an explosion and start watching for transfer. That is how debt crises work in mature monetary systems. Not as one event, as a migration. From saver to debtor, from worker to asset owner, from cash to claims on real things, from the public to the state, from the people who thought prudence would protect them to the people who already owned the right side of inflation. That is the cruel truth. I want you to picture the national debt the way I picture it, not as a number on a website, as a pressure system. It sits in the Treasury market, it sits in the tax code, it sits in the Fed's policy choices, it sits in the value of your dollars, it sits in what your bank pays you, it sits in what your bond portfolio earns, it sits in your insurance premium, your grocery bill, your property tax, your wage growth, your retirement assumptions, and your standard of living debt. This large does not stay abstract. It leaks into daily life. That is why people who dismiss debt because the government owes it to itself, or because America can always print, are telling only half the story. Yes, a sovereign that controls its own currency can keep paying in nominal terms, but the burden does not disappear just because default disappears. It reappears as debasement. It reappears as lower real returns. It reappears as a slower theft. That is what people miss. They think default is the only danger. It is usually the less sophisticated danger. The more sophisticated danger is being paid back in money. That means less than the money you lent. That is how a system can keep its promises while still breaking faith with the saver. And if you want to understand what may come next under a new Fed chair, you have to look backward before you look forward. After World War II, the United States had a debt problem large enough to frighten serious people. The debt burden did not disappear because Washington turned virtuous. It eased because the country ran a form of financial repression. Short version, rates were held low, inflation often ran above those rates, and major institutions were pushed or incentivized to hold government debt. Anyway, the result was a transfer from savers to the state. Fay turn 49 file 0 Fay, that is not ancient trivia. It is a pattern, and patterns matter more than slogans. Financial repression sounds like a phrase you would hear in a central bank seminar and forget before lunch, but in plain English, it means this. The government becomes richer by making savers poorer slowly enough that many of them do not notice the mechanism in time. If inflation is 4% and you are earning 2% on your supposedly safe money, you are losing in real terms. If pension funds, banks, and regulated pools of capital are steered toward holding government debt at yields that do not preserve purchasing power, they become involuntary helpers in the state's refinancing plan. If asset prices rise because money is cheap and financial conditions remain friendly to ownership, then people who already own productive things get richer while people who only save in nominal claims fall behind. That is the formula. Cheap money for debtors, negative real returns for savers, asset inflation for owners, cultural confusion for everyone else. This is why I say the most important identity change in the second half of life is the shift from saver to owner. Not because saving is foolish, because saving alone is strategically weak in a system that is trying to reduce its debt burden without formally repudiating it. That is the mistake ordinary people make. They still think being prudent means holding cash, buying CDs, and hoping higher rates will protect them. That logic only works if the system decides to reward prudence. Deeply indebted systems usually reward something else. They reward ownership. You can hate that fact. It remains a fact. And this is where the debate around the new Fed chair becomes interesting. Warsh's public ideas, as reported in recent coverage, include lower rates, a smaller Fed balance sheet, and a belief that AI-led productivity could help cool inflationary pressure over time. Reuters has also reported that he reiterated support for a smaller Fed balance sheet during his confirmation hearing and argued that the central bank should hold fewer bonds. Faysite Fay turn 312,263 search 1 Fay turn 312,263 search 5 Fay turn 312,263 news 35 Fay now. Whether every piece of that vision works the way its advocates hope is another matter entirely, because here is the tension that most people will miss. Cutting rates helps the debt math. Selling bonds from the Fed's balance sheet can work against that by pushing more duration into private hands and potentially raising term yields, unless demand is strong enough to absorb it. Invoking AI as the force that lets you have lower rates without a renewed inflation problem is elegant. But elegance is not the same thing as proof. Markets do not care whether a story is elegant. They care whether the plumbing works. That is why I think the real issue is not whether the next chair is for lower rates or for a smaller balance sheet. The real issue is what happens if the government's need for cheaper financing collides with insufficient organic demand for its debt at the desired price. History suggests that when that happens, systems get creative, new regulations, new incentives, new capital rules, new reasons why banks, pensions, insurers, or other institutions should prudently hold more government paper, not formally forced, merely nudged, guided, encouraged, optimized, and made to understand that the other options are less attractive. That is usually how repression arrives in modern dress, not with a shouted command, with a narrower menu. And this is why I think the debt story matters so much more than the personality story. People love to reduce structural problems to individuals. It is emotionally easier, Powell versus Warsh, President versus Fed, Hawk versus Dove. But the structural problem is that the United States now finances itself much more sensitively than it did in earlier eras because so much borrowing rolls at shorter maturities. The government's debt profile is more like an adjustable rate mortgage than a fixed rate legacy burden. If rates stay higher, the interest bill bites harder. If rates come down, the burden eases faster. That is why the pressure to prefer lower rates is so obvious. Faysite Fay turn 49 file 0 Fay, and if lower rates arrive while inflation stays meaningfully above them, the old repression machinery starts humming again. That does not mean there will be a dramatic declaration. It means the saver loses quietly. It means the person holding too much cash in the bank gets paid in nominal terms and robbed in real terms. It means the person sitting in long-duration fixed claims without inflation protection becomes a funding source for a system he does not control. It means that people who own productive assets, real estate, businesses, equities, scarce things, and pricing power stand on the better side of the transfer. This is why I refuse to treat the debt crisis as a matter for policy nerds only. It is a household issue. If the next chapter is some version of financial repression, then the question facing ordinary people becomes very practical. What side of the transfer am I living on? Am I the one whose cash is being diluted or the one whose assets are repricing? Am I holding promises or am I holding productive claims? Am I waiting for safety to return to savings accounts? Or am I already positioned in things that can defend purchasing power? That is the grown-up version of the question, not who will be the next Fed chair. That is interesting but not sufficient. The sufficient question is, what kind of world does a $39 trillion dollar debt burden push policymakers toward, and what does that world do to the average saver? Once you ask that honestly, a lot of fashionable nonsense falls away. You stop fantasizing that the debt will be paid down in the household sense. You stop treating cash as neutral. You stop assuming that a positive balance in a bank means safety. You stop confusing nominal preservation with real preservation. And perhaps most importantly, you stop worshiping the old map. The old map said this: work hard, save in safe accounts, buy bonds. Wait, the new map is harsher. It says saving is necessary but insufficient. It says your savings must graduate into ownership before the transfer becomes too obvious. It says you need liquidity, yes, but you also need assets that can live through a world of negative real returns. It says you need some mix of productive businesses, broad equity exposure, perhaps real estate, perhaps commodities or scarce stores of value, and a balance sheet disciplined enough that volatility cannot blackmail you into stupidity. This is one reason I think older investors are often advised badly. They are told to become too conservative at exactly the moment when inflation becomes one of the most dangerous threats to the integrity of their retirement. They flee into fixed nominal income and then spend 20 years watching prices rise faster than their safe portfolio. That is not conservative. That is surrender. Real conservatism in an indebted age is not hiding. It is owning the right kinds of claims in the right proportions while keeping enough liquidity that you never become a forced seller. That is a very different thing, and it is why I keep returning to the owner versus saver distinction. The saver asks, what is the safest yield I can get today? The owner asks, what can still defend me if the rules are being rewritten in favor of debtors? The saver asks, where can I avoid volatility? The owner asks, where can I survive volatility without letting inflation hollow me out? The saver hopes the system returns to rewarding waiting. The owner studies the system and acts accordingly when it does not. This is not cynicism, it is adaptation. Now, let me say something equally important. None of this means recklessness. It does not mean throwing your life savings into whatever asset class had the loudest chart last year. It does not mean pretending every inflationary regime looks the same. It does not mean abandoning bonds altogether, nor does it mean worshiping gold, stocks, real estate, or Bitcoin like a convert seeking a religion. That kind of thinking is just fear wearing a different costume. What it does mean is that a person serious about preserving and growing wealth in the next phase should stop acting as though a high debt monetary system is a neutral backdrop. It is not neutral, it has a bias. And that bias usually favors debtors and owners over savers. If you ignore that bias, you are not being prudent. You are volunteering to subsidize it. This is why I think the real opportunity in a debt crisis regime is not some single secret investment. It is clarity. Clarity about what kind of game is being played. Clarity about how governments usually manage unsustainable debt burdens. Clarity about the difference between nominal and real returns. Clarity about what your household balance sheet would look like if the country entered a long stretch of lower rates, sticky inflation, and policy designed to keep debt service manageable. That clarity changes behavior. It makes you less likely to sit and cash out of false comfort. It makes you less likely to believe that bank yields are a solution. It makes you more likely to own productive assets. It makes you more likely to think in terms of balance sheet resilience instead of temporary calm. And most importantly, it helps you understand that the debt problem is not something happening out there in Washington. It is something that sooner or later gets distributed into your own financial life. That is how these stories end. Not with one giant national reckoning, with millions of smaller personal ones. So if I were writing the rule book for the next chapter in plain English, it would go like this. First, respect liquidity, but do not worship cash. Second, kill expensive personal debt, because in an unstable regime, your own leverage becomes your enemy before the government's. Leverage becomes the headline. Third, own productive assets, because ownership is the side of the transfer that tends to keep up. Fourth, understand that low rates below inflation are not a gift. They are a policy choice with winners and losers. Fifth, do not let complexity distract you from the core fact that financial repression is just a sophisticated way of making patient savers finance a heavily indebted state. That is the whole story. And if I had to write a contract with my future self after studying this debt setup, honestly, it would say this: I will not wait for the government to fix the debt as though it were a household. I will not mistake nominal safety for real safety. I will not let a positive bank balance fool me into thinking my purchasing power is protected. I will own assets that can live through a world where debtors are favored and savers are quietly taxed through inflation and low real rates. I will keep enough liquidity that I never have to sell my future at the worst possible moment. I will think like an owner, not just a saver. And I will remember that when a country tries to make a $39 trillion debt burden feel smaller, it rarely happens by making the debt disappear. It happens by making the money, the rates, and the incentives push the pain somewhere else. My job is to make sure it is not all pushed onto me.